They sold my house while I was lying in a hospital bed with a tube in my throat. 3 days. That's all it took. 3 days for a woman with a clipboard and a grudge to erase 11 years of my life. And when I finally walked back through my own front door, a stranger in a bathrobe told me to get off his property. My name is Ethan Calloway. I'm 36 years old. I'm a contractor by trade and a volunteer firefighter by choice, and until the summer everything fell apart. I thought the worst thing that could ever happen to me had already happened. I was wrong. The worst thing was still coming, and it wore a name tag that said HOA President. Let me back up, because you need to understand what I lost before you understand what I did to get it back. I bought the house on Larkspur Court 9 years ago, back when my wife Rachel was still alive, and Lily was just a fussy 2-year-old who wouldn't sleep unless the hallway light was on. It was a small brick colonial in a neighborhood called Whispering Pines Estates, the kind of place with matching mailboxes and a community pool nobody used after Labor Day. We picked it because of the school district, and because Rachel loved the oak tree in the backyard, the one I eventually hung a tire swing from. Rachel died 2 years later. Aneurysm. No warning, no goodbye, just a Tuesday morning that turned into the worst day of my life, and then thousands of days after it that I had to figure out how to survive without her. She'd made pancakes that morning, the same recipe her mother taught her, and she was laughing about something Lily said when she suddenly stopped mid-sentence and put her hand against the counter like she needed to steady herself. I asked if she was okay. She said she just felt a little dizzy, that she'd be fine in a minute. She was gone before the ambulance made it 3 streets over. I've replayed that morning so many times that I sometimes can't tell anymore which parts are real memory and which parts are just the shape my grief carved out over the years. I raised Lily alone after that. Some nights were brutal, the kind where I sat on the bathroom floor at 2 in the morning so she wouldn't hear me falling apart through the wall. Other nights we made it work, spaghetti 3 times a week, homework at the kitchen table, bedtime stories about a fox named Chester who was somehow always getting into and out of trouble in the woods behind our house. I kept the house on Larkspur Court because it was the last place that still smelled like Rachel on rainy days, because her handwriting was still on the inside of the pantry door where she'd scrawled grocery lists nobody would ever throw away, and because Lily needed something in her life that didn't change while everything else already had. I built decks and remodeled kitchens for a living, and 3 nights a week, plus every emergency call that came through, I put on turnout gear and rode with Station 14. It wasn't about the paycheck. Volunteer firefighters in our county got a stipend that barely covered gas money. I did it because 11 years ago, before I even met Rachel, a stranger pulled me out of a car that was about to go up in flames, and I never forgot what that felt like, being saved by someone who owed me nothing. I tell you all of this not to make myself sound like a hero. I tell you this because it matters later. It matters because the people who did what they did to me knew exactly who I was, knew exactly what I did for this town, and decided none of it was worth anything the moment it became inconvenient for them. The woman at the center of this story is named Vivian Kessler. She'd been president of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association for 6 years by the time this happened, and if you've ever lived under an HOA, you already know the type. Vivian didn't walk into a room, she arrived in it. She drove a white Lexus with a vanity plate that said WPHOA1. She wore blazers to walk her dog, and she had opinions about the height of everyone's grass that bordered on obsession. Our first real conflict happened about 8 months before the hospital. Lily wanted a basketball hoop for her birthday, one of those portable ones you fill with sand at the base. I put it at the edge of our driveway, nowhere near the street, nowhere near a neighbor's line of sight. 3 days later, I got a violation notice taped to my door. Unapproved structure. I laughed at first, because a basketball hoop is not a structure, it's a birthday present, but Vivian didn't laugh. She sent a second notice, then a third, and by the 4th one, she was threatening a fine of $200 a week until I removed it. I went to the next HOA meeting to fight it, because I'm not the kind of man who backs down from something this small and stupid. I stood up in front of maybe 30 neighbors in the community clubhouse and asked Vivian to point to the exact bylaw that classified a portable basketball hoop as a structure requiring architectural approval. She couldn't. She fumbled through a binder for almost a full minute while people started whispering, and when she finally gave up, she said something I should have taken more seriously than I did. She looked right at me and said, "We'll revisit this, Mr. Calloway. Don't think this is over." A few people clapped when I sat back down, which I think embarrassed her more than the binder ever could. I remember Denise Okafor, a board member I barely knew at the time, catching my eye from across the room with the smallest hint of a smile, like she'd been waiting a long time for someone to finally push back. I didn't think much of it then. I think about it constantly now. I thought Vivian meant the basketball hoop. I know now she meant me. After that meeting, small things started happening, the kind of things you don't notice individually, but that add up into a pattern if you're paying attention, which I wasn't, not really, not until it was too late. My trash cans, which I always brought in by evening the same day pickup happened, got photographed at 10 in the morning like I'd left them out overnight, even though I hadn't. I found out later Vivian had a habit of driving the neighborhood herself before dawn some mornings, camera phone in hand, building a file. My truck, parked in my own driveway because I needed the tools in the bed for early jobs, got flagged as a commercial vehicle violation, even though half the contractors and landscapers on that street parked work trucks in their own driveways every single night without a single letter showing up on their doors. None of them got letters. I did. I got a notice about a garden flag Lily had picked out at the school fair, some cartoon character on a stick that stood maybe 18 inches tall, cited as an unapproved yard ornament. I got a notice about the color of the mulch I'd put down around the front flower bed, apparently 2 shades darker than the HOA's approved palette, a palette I hadn't even known existed until that letter arrived. Each time I called the office to ask for clarification, I got a different excuse for why nobody could meet with me that week. Each time I showed up in person, Vivian was somehow always just stepping into a meeting, always just on her way out, always too busy to give me 5 minutes. I should have seen the pattern building. I didn't because I was busy. Lily had started 3rd grade, I had 3 renovation jobs running at once, and Station 14 had been short-staffed all summer because 2 of our senior guys retired the same month. I didn't have room in my head to worry about a woman with a grudge and a laminated rulebook. That was my mistake. I let it slide because I had bigger things to do, and Vivian Kessler is the kind of person who takes silence as surrender. The night everything changed started like any other Thursday. I just tucked Lily in, told her the same made-up story about a fox named Chester that she'd been demanding every night for 2 years, and I was rinsing dishes when my pager went off. Structure fire, Miller Street, possible occupants trapped. Miller Street was 4 minutes from my house. I told my neighbor Denise, who watched Lily whenever a call came in during the evening, and I was in my gear and out the door before the second alarm tone finished. The house was already fully involved by the time I got there, flames coming through the second-floor windows in thick orange sheets, black smoke rolling off the roofline in a way that told every one of us this fire had been burning a long time before anyone called it in. The heat hit me from 30 feet away before I even had my mask on. The homeowner, an elderly man named Walter Briggs, was standing on the front lawn in his pajamas, barefoot on the wet grass, screaming that his wife was still inside, that she used a walker, that she couldn't get down the stairs on her own, that he'd gone out to check the mailbox and come back to find the kitchen already burning. I don't remember making the decision to go in. That's the honest truth. 12 years of training takes over in moments like that, and your body moves before your brain finishes the thought. Danny Ruiz, my partner that night, grabbed my arm for half a second, the way you do when you need the other guy to look you in the eye before you both do something insane, and then we went in through the side door together, him covering the hallway behind me while I pushed toward the stairs. The heat inside was a physical wall. I've been in enough structure fires to know the difference between bad and catastrophic, and this one was already tipping toward catastrophic by the time my boots hit the first stair. I found Walter's wife, Doris, on the floor of the upstairs bedroom, her walker knocked over beside her, smoke thick enough that I couldn't see my own gloved hand in front of my face mask. She was conscious, barely, coughing, reaching for me before I even got fully into the room, like some part of her had heard me coming through the smoke and refused to give up. I got her onto my shoulder in a fireman's carry, felt her fragile weight settle against me, and started back toward the stairwell, counting steps in my head the way we are trained to: 3 steps, 5 steps, almost there. I was 3 steps from the top of the stairwell when the ceiling came down. I don't remember the fall. I remember heat, and a sound I can only describe as the whole house exhaling, and then I remember nothing at all for what felt like no time and turned out to be the better part of 3 days. When I finally surfaced, really surfaced, not just the half-conscious flickers the nurses told me about later, I woke up in a hospital bed with a breathing tube down my throat, my right leg elevated in a brace, monitors beeping somewhere behind my head, and my father, a man I hadn't spoken more than a handful of words to in almost a year, sitting in the corner of the room with his head in his hands like he was praying or breaking or both. He looked up when the machines changed rhythm, and I watched his whole face collapse with relief. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood up, walked over, and put his hand flat against my forehead the way he used to when I was a kid, and he was checking for a fever, and he said my name twice, quiet, like he was making sure it was really me in there. Doris Briggs survived. I found that out later, and it's the one piece of that night I can still think about without wanting to put my fist through a wall. I took a beam across my back and leg on the way down the stairwell, cracked 2 ribs, tore ligaments in my knee badly enough that the surgeon talked about a full reconstruction before deciding against it, and inhaled enough smoke that the doctors kept me sedated and intubated for most of the first 2 days just to let my lungs recover without me fighting the tube. I was in that hospital bed, unconscious or barely conscious, drifting in and out under sedation, for 3 full days. 3 days. During those 3 days, my father took care of Lily. My phone sat dead in a hospital drawer because nobody thought to charge it, because nobody thought about anything except whether I was going to keep breathing on my own. My mail sat in my mailbox. My house sat empty and dark and quiet on Larkspur Court, exactly the way it had every other night of my life, except this time somebody was watching it, waiting for it. I found out what happened during those 3 days almost 2 weeks later, and when I finally understood the timeline, I felt something in my chest that was colder and harder than anything I felt watching that ceiling come down on me. Here's what happened while I couldn't defend myself. The day after the fire, while I was still sedated in the ICU, Vivian Kessler called an emergency HOA board meeting. Not a regular meeting, an emergency one, which under our HOA's bylaws only required 48 hours notice instead of the usual 2 weeks, and which only required a quorum of 3 board members instead of the full 7. Vivian made sure exactly 3 people showed up. Herself, the treasurer, a man named Harold Prout, who did whatever Vivian told him to do, and a board member named Denise Okafor, who I later learned had actually tried to object and been shouted down. At that meeting, Vivian presented what she called an outstanding violation and fine balance on my property. She claimed I had failed to respond to 7 violation notices over the preceding 4 months, that my account was delinquent by $4,200 in unpaid fines and late fees, and that under Section 12, subsection C of the HOA's governing covenants, the association had the right to place an emergency lien on any property with delinquent fines exceeding the threshold amount, and to pursue expedited sale of the property if the homeowner failed to respond within 72 hours. 72 hours, 3 days, the exact 3 days I was unconscious in a hospital bed with a machine breathing for me. The notices Vivian claimed I never responded to, 4 of them I had responded to in writing, with photos proving compliance, sitting in a folder in my own filing cabinet. 2 of them were about the basketball hoop dispute that had already been settled in the previous meeting's minutes, which somehow got left out of the record Vivian presented. And 1 of them, the final notice that supposedly started the 72-hour countdown, was dated the exact same day as the fire. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I had to sit with it for a lot longer than a second when I finally figured it out. The letter that triggered the clock on losing my house was postmarked the same day I was pulling an 81-year-old woman out of a burning building. Vivian didn't know about the fire when she wrote it. Or maybe she did. I still don't know which possibility is worse. The board, all three of them, voted to authorize the lien and the expedited sale process. Harold Prout didn't ask a single question. Denise Okafor asked to see the original notices and was told by Vivian that the paperwork was, quote, being finalized by our attorney and would be available after the vote. Denise voted no. She was outvoted 2-1 because in an emergency meeting with only 3 members present, 2 votes was all it took. Within 24 hours, a lien was filed with the county recorder's office. Within 48 hours, a private process server posted a notice on my front door that nobody was home to receive because Lily was staying with my father and my house was completely empty. Within the full 72 hours, with me still unconscious in the ICU and nobody in the world checking my mailbox, the HOA's attorney filed for an emergency expedited sale under a clause in our state's HOA law that exists for genuinely delinquent, abandoned, or unresponsive properties. My property was none of those things, but on paper, in the 72 hours that mattered, it looked exactly like all 3. The house sold 4 days later at what's called a lien sale, a quiet, mostly unadvertised auction that happens on the courthouse steps and that almost nobody outside of investors and lawyers ever attends. My house, worth roughly $340,000, sold for $22,000, which was just enough to cover the fabricated fine balance plus legal fees plus what the HOA called administrative costs. The buyer was a man named Gary Thorne. I didn't know who Gary Thorne was yet. I would find out soon enough, and when I did, it would be the piece of this whole nightmare that made me stop grieving and start fighting. I came home from the hospital on a Sunday afternoon, still moving slow, still on crutches, my ribs wrapped and aching with every breath, my daughter's hand gripping mine so tight it left marks. My father drove us. I remember turning onto Larkspur Court and seeing a U-Haul in my driveway before I even registered what I was looking at. There was a man on my front porch, carrying a box through my front door, a man I had never seen in my life. I got out of the car before it fully stopped. I remember my father calling my name behind me, telling me to slow down, but I didn't slow down. I walked up my own driveway on a leg that had been shattered 5 days earlier, and I said the only thing that made sense to say. "That's my house. What are you doing in my house?" The man turned around. He was maybe 50, soft around the middle, wearing a bathrobe over gym shorts like he'd already made himself at home enough not to bother getting fully dressed. He looked at me like I was the intruder. "This is my house now, buddy," he said. "You need to leave before I call the police." I want to tell you I stayed calm. I didn't. I told him this was insane, that I'd lived here for 9 years, that my daughter's height marks were still penciled onto the door frame in the kitchen, that whatever paperwork he thought he had was a mistake, that I'd just gotten out of the hospital and he needed to get out of my house right now before I called the police myself. My voice was loud enough that a neighbor 2 doors down stepped out onto her porch to watch, and I remember thinking, in some distant corner of my mind, that this was the first time in 9 years I'd ever raised my voice on that street. He didn't argue with me about any of it. He didn't even flinch. He just pulled a folded document out of his robe pocket, calm as anything, like he'd been carrying it around specifically for a moment like this, already knowing someone might come back demanding answers, and held it up between 2 fingers like it settled the matter permanently. A recorded deed, my address, his name, dated 4 days earlier. "HOA sold it clean and legal," he said. "Ask them, not me. I bought it fair at auction." Lily was crying behind me. My father had his hand on my shoulder, trying to pull me back toward the car before I did something that would land me in handcuffs on top of everything else. And I stood there in my own driveway, in front of my own house, looking at a stranger holding a deed with my address on it, and I felt something break inside my chest that had nothing to do with the ribs. We didn't have anywhere to go that night, except my father's cramped 2-bedroom apartment across town, Lily sleeping on the pull-out couch, me lying awake on an air mattress with my leg throbbing and my mind running through everything I'd just seen, trying to make it add up into something that made sense. It didn't. None of it made sense. That night, lying on the air mattress, listening to my father's old window unit rattle in the next room, I heard Lily crying quietly through the wall, trying not to let me hear her. I got up, ignoring the pain screaming through my knee, and sat on the edge of the pull-out couch next to her. "Are we ever going home?" she asked me. She wasn't looking at me when she said it. She was looking at the ceiling, at nothing, the way kids do when they're asking a question they're scared of the answer to. "Yes," I told her, and I meant it more fiercely than I'd meant almost anything in my life. "I promise you, Lily, whatever it takes, we're going home." She didn't say anything else. She just reached out and grabbed my hand and held onto it until she fell asleep, and I sat there on the edge of that pull-out couch for almost an hour afterward, my knee throbbing, my mind refusing to slow down, turning over every version of what I might say to Vivian Kessler in the morning. The next morning, still on crutches, still barely able to climb the 2 low steps into the HOA office, I went anyway. My father offered to come with me. I told him no. Whatever was about to happen in that room, I needed to be the one standing in front of it. Vivian Kessler was sitting behind her desk when I walked in, and I want you to understand something about her face in that moment, because I've thought about it 100 times since. She wasn't surprised to see me. She wasn't nervous. She looked at me the way you'd look at a problem you'd already solved, filing paperwork, sipping coffee from a mug that said World's OKAYST HOA President, like it was a joke someone had bought her as a gift. "Mr. Calloway," she said, like we were meeting for a scheduled appointment, not a man on crutches standing in her doorway with his whole life upended. "I heard about your accident. I'm so glad you're recovering." She said it the exact same way she might comment on the weather, pleasant, practiced, utterly disconnected from the reality of what her office had just done to me. "You sold my house," I said. "The association followed its established process for delinquent accounts," she said, still perfectly pleasant, still not looking up from whatever she was writing. "You had multiple unresolved violations and an outstanding fine balance. The notices were sent according to bylaw requirements. When a homeowner doesn't respond within the required window, the board is obligated to act. I'm sorry it happened while you were dealing with your injury, truly. But the timeline is the timeline." "I was in a coma," I said. "I was intubated in the ICU pulling a woman out of a burning building while your board was voting to take my house." For just a second, just 1 second, something flickered behind her eyes. Not guilt. I want to be clear about that, because I've replayed this moment enough times to be sure. It wasn't guilt. It was something closer to satisfaction. "That's a very sympathetic story," she said, "but the association isn't required to verify a homeowner's personal circumstances before enforcing its covenants. You can certainly speak to an attorney if you feel the process was mishandled. The sale has already been recorded with the county, though. I don't believe there's much that can be undone at this point." I asked her for copies of the 7 violation notices she claimed I never responded to. She told me the file was, quote, "with our legal counsel," and that I'd need to submit a formal records request, which under the bylaws could take up to 30 business days to process. 30 business days. My house had been sold to a stranger in 72 hours, but getting the paperwork that supposedly justified it would take a month and a half. Before I left, I asked her one more question, mostly because I couldn't stop myself. "Doesn't it bother you at all that I was unconscious, saving someone's grandmother, while your board decided I didn't deserve a phone call before you took my house?" Vivian finally looked up from her paperwork. "Mr. Calloway, I run this association fairly, for everyone. If I made exceptions every time a homeowner had a difficult week, this neighborhood would fall apart. Rules exist so nobody has to rely on sympathy." I wanted to tell her that a man risking his life to pull a stranger out of a burning house wasn't having a difficult week. It was the reason she got to sleep safely in her own bed every night without a second thought about house fires. I didn't say it. I just turned around and walked out, because I understood in that moment that nothing I said in that office was going to reach her. I want to tell you, I had a plan walking out of that office. I didn't. I had a busted knee, 3 cracked ribs, a homeless 9-year-old daughter sleeping on my father's pull-out couch, and a woman behind a desk who looked like she'd already won. Word travels fast in a neighborhood like Whispering Pines Estates, and by the time I got back to my truck, two neighbors were already waiting near my old driveway, having heard through the grapevine what happened. One of them, an older man named Frank Delgado who'd lived 3 doors down since before I moved in, put his hand on my shoulder and told me he'd had his own run-ins with Vivian over the years. Nothing this extreme, but enough that he wasn't surprised she was capable of something like this. Frank told me something that stuck with me. He said Vivian had tried something similar with an elderly widow 2 streets over a few years back. Before I moved in, some dispute over unpaid dues that got settled quietly when the widow's son, a lawyer in another state, got involved and made threats of his own. Nobody talked about it publicly. It just went away. That was the first time I understood I might not be the first person Vivian Kessler had done this to. It wouldn't be the last time I learned that, either. But on my way out, something caught my eye. A framed photo on the wall of Vivian's office, one of those community event collages the HOA puts up every year. Board members, neighborhood picnic, faces I recognized from 6 years of these clubhouse meetings. And standing right next to Vivian in that photo, arm around her shoulder, laughing at whatever joke someone had just told, was a face I'd seen only once before. The man in the bathrobe, the man now living in my house. Gary Thorne wasn't a random buyer who happened to show up at a courthouse auction. Gary Thorne was standing in a photo on Vivian Kessler's office wall, close enough, familiar enough, comfortable enough, an arm slung casually around her shoulder in a way that spoke of years of familiarity, not a chance meeting between an HOA president and a stranger who happened to bid on a foreclosed property. I stood there staring at that photo for longer than I should have, long enough that I heard Vivian's chair creak behind me as she stood up from her desk. I turned away before she could see what I'd been looking at, muttered something about needing air, and walked out before my face gave away what I'd just figured out. I didn't say anything to her. I didn't want her to know I'd seen it. Not yet, not until I understood exactly what I was looking at. I just walked out to my truck, sat behind the wheel with my hands shaking so badly I had to wait almost 10 minutes before I trusted myself to drive, and started putting pieces together that I hadn't let myself consider yet. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't an overzealous HOA president who got carried away with the rules. This was planned. Someone had watched my house, tracked my basketball hoop complaint, waited for an opening, and the moment I went into that burning building on Miller Street, someone saw an opportunity instead of a tragedy. I drove home that night, except it wasn't home anymore. It was just a street I used to live on, and I sat in my truck outside the house with the lights on inside that used to be mine, and I made myself a promise. I was going to find out exactly what Vivian Kessler and Gary Thorne had done, and I was going to make sure every single person in Whispering Pines Estates knew about it before I was finished. I had no idea yet how deep it went. I had no idea about the backdated letters, the missing board minutes, the second property Gary Thorne had already flipped the same way 18 months earlier in a neighborhood 2 towns over. I had no idea that Denise Okafor, the one board member who'd voted no, was sitting at home with a folder of her own, waiting for someone brave enough or angry enough to knock on her door and ask the right questions. I had no idea that a retired schoolteacher named Priya Anand, 2 towns away, had spent almost 2 years quietly wondering if she'd made a mistake staying silent after resigning from her own HOA board under circumstances that would soon sound painfully familiar. All I had that first night was a legal pad, 6 pages of half-remembered dates, a busted knee, and a fire in my chest that hadn't existed 24 hours earlier. I sat at my father's kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to sleep, staring at the notes I'd made, trying to figure out where a person even begins when the system that's supposed to protect them has already been used as the weapon against them. All I knew, sitting in that truck with my ribs aching and my daughter waiting at my father's apartment for me to tell her when we were going home, was that I wasn't going to let this stand. Not after what I'd survived to get back to her. Not after everything Rachel and I had built in that house, before cancer, before fire, before a woman with a clipboard decided my life was worth less than the paperwork she could manufacture against it. I still didn't know how I was going to fight a recorded deed a legal sale, and an HOA board that had every piece of paper stacked in their favor. But 3 nights later, going through a box of old mail I'd grabbed from my truck before the fire, I found something that changed everything. A voicemail I'd saved and forgotten about, recorded almost a year earlier during the basketball hoop dispute, that I'd kept on my phone as a joke to show Rachel's sister how ridiculous Vivian Kessler could be. I hit play and I heard Vivian Kessler's voice, clear as day, saying something she never should have said out loud.